international collaboration for strengthening regional and global partnerships. उपस्थित सभी अतिथिगण से पुनः निवेदन है, कृपया शीघ्र अपने स्थान ग्रहण कर लें। इस हॉल में हम शुरुआत करने जा रहे हैं थीमेटिक सेशन 5 की, जिसकी थीम है इंटरनेशनल कोलैबोरेशन फॉर स्ट्रेंथनिंग रीजनल एंड ग्लोबल पार्टनरशिप्स। इस सेशन के सभी प्रतिभागियों से निवेदन है, कृपया शीघ्र अपने स्थान ग्रहण कर लें। We would once again request everyone to kindly take their seats so that we can begin with the proceedings as soon as possible and sort of try to make up for the lost time that we had because of the overstretching of the first session. And ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome on stage our distinguished session chair, Shri Sujan R. Chenoy, Director General, Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence and Analysis. We welcome our co-chair, Shri Shombi Sharp, UN Resident Coordinator in India. I also welcome our eminent panelist, Shri Ranjit Ray, former India's ambassador to Hungary, Vietnam and Nepal, Shri Amit Prothiji, DG CDRI New Delhi, Dr. Krishna S. Vatsa, member NDMA, and our session coordinator, Shri Naval Prakash, JA-NDMA, and our rapporteur for this session is Ms. Fatima Amin, who is a young professional from NIDM. So, ladies and gentlemen, kindly take your seats, all mobile phones either switched off or put on to silent mode. Namaskar and good morning. Distinguished Session Chair, Shri Chenoy-ji, Director General, Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence and Analysis, Co-Chair, eminent panelist, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to the thematic session 5 on international collaboration for strengthening regional and global partnerships on day 2 of the third session for NPDRR 2023. आपदा जोखिम न्यूनीकरण के लिए राष्ट्रीय मंच के तीसरे सत्र के थीमेटिक सेशन 5 में आप सबका हार्दिक स्वागत है. Ladies and gentlemen, India's disaster assistance is facilitated by its active participation in international, regional and bilateral arrangements in the Indian Ocean and beyond. And India has been supportive of several multilateral initiatives in disaster management, which also include setting up of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. And ladies and gentlemen, the thematic session on international cooperation for strengthening regional and global partnerships seek to discuss these issues drawing from the country's experiences in international assistance. The time duration of the session is approximately 1 hour 15 minutes, which includes the opening and closing remarks by the session chair, remarks by the co-chair, and panel discussion with our esteemed panelist, which will be followed by an open forum discussion with all the participants if the time permits. But before I hand over to our distinguished chair of this session, ladies and gentlemen, I have the proud privilege of introducing the eminent panel. Our chair, Shri Sujan R. Chenoy-ji, is Director General, Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence and Analysis. He is the Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute, New Delhi, since 3rd of January 2019. A career diplomat of the Indian Foreign Services from 1981 to 2018. He was India's ambassador to Japan and the Republic of Marshall Islands from 2015 to 18, and earlier the ambassador to Mexico and High Commissioner to Belize. A specialist with over 25 years of experience in China, East Asia and Asia Pacific. He served in Indian missions in Hong Kong and Beijing and as Consul General in Shanghai and Sydney. He also served as India's representative to the First Committee at the United Nations in New York, dealing with disarmament and international security affairs, and in the Indian mission in Riyadh. A very warm welcome to you, sir. Our distinguished co-chair, Mr. Shombi Sharp, is UN Resident Coordinator, has devoted more than 25 years of his career to promoting inclusive, sustainable development internationally, bringing experience he has acquired at the United Nations and externally to this new position. Within the organization, he most recently served as United Nations Resident Coordinator in Armenia, after holding several leadership positions at the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, where he was resident representative in Armenia, deputy resident representative in Georgia, deputy country director in Lebanon, regional HIV/AIDS practice team leader for UNDP Europe, and Commonwealth of Independent States in Russia. Was the program manager for the Western Balkans in New York and assistant resident representative in Russia. A very warm welcome to you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, our eminent panelist, Mr. Ranjit Ray is former ambassador to Nepal, was an Indian diplomat with over 30 years of experience in the Indian Foreign Service, which includes participation in complex negotiations both at bilateral and multilateral levels, and extensive work in conflict areas and crisis situations. Having started his career path in Vienna, where he acquired proficiency in German, he has since held various positions in international and state organizations and bodies, including the Permanent Mission of India to the United Nations, the UN Advisory Committee on Administrative Budgetary Questions, as well as the offices of the Minister of External Affairs and of the President of India. And a very warm welcome to you, sir. Our eminent panelist, Shri Amit Prothi, DGCDRI, New Delhi, brings a wealth of international experience and expertise on climate and disaster resilience issues. He is an international expert with nearly 25 years of progressive leadership in the fields of urban planning and resilient infrastructure, with experience across more than 15 countries in North America, Asia, and Europe. He has managed multidisciplinary teams on thematic topics and relate to climate change mitigation and adaptation, including environmental planning, urban policy, land use and transportation planning, nature resource management, flood management, disaster resilient infrastructure, etc. And we warmly welcome you, sir. Our eminent panelist, Shri Krishna Vatsa, member NDMA, has worked as Policy Advisor, Disaster Recovery Bureau for Policy and Program Support, BPS, UNDP in New York and Nairobi during the year 2015 to 20. Has served as the Regional Disaster Reduction Advisor South and Southwest Asia in New Delhi from 2008 to 14, and he joined UNDP in 2007 as Early Recovery Coordinator in the Philippines. As a career civil servant, Shri Vatsa joined the Maharashtra Emergency Earthquake Rehabilitation Program in the state of Maharashtra in 1995 and implemented a large-scale earthquake recovery program during the next 4 years. He also served as Secretary to the Government of Maharashtra, Relief and Rehabilitation from 2003 to 6, and then as Secretary Rural Development and Panchayati Raj from 2006 to 7. In course of his career, he extensively consulted for several national and international organizations in the area of disaster risk reduction and recovery. And a warm welcome to you also, sir. So, ladies and gentlemen, with those words of introduction, may I hand over to our session chair to kindly carry forward the proceedings of this session, and may I request you, sir, to begin with your opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Good morning, namaskar to all of you. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting us to participate and share our views at the National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, and especially the third session that's being held from 10 to 11 March. And we are fortunate to have this privilege to participate in the thematic Session 5, International Cooperation for Strengthening Regional and Global Partnerships. And as you all know, there is a very eminent panel of speakers. And I also want to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Shombi Sharp, Ambassador Ranjit Ray, Shri Amit Prothi, Shri Krishna Vatsa, and also my good friend, Shri Kamal Kishore, who is Member Secretary of the NDMA. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to speak briefly about this topic of international collaboration for strengthening regional and global partnerships. And the point of inflection for me is the fact that one of the greatest challenges facing us today is climate change, global warming, and the fact that this has made weather and natural disasters more frequent, more devastating, and harder to predict and prevent. Therein lies the kind of logic that global problems on this scale and dimension cannot be addressed adequately without regional and global cooperation. Just as we say in Sanskrit, we have a saying, yatha hekena na rathasya yatha hekena rathasya yatha hekena na rathasya gatir bhavat evam purush karen bina daivam na siddhyate. Unless we work together, we will be like a chariot that is trying to move on one wheel. So we have to ensure that there is greater regional and global cooperation. Now, India, as you all know, has a particular profile. It has played a very, very important role in disaster management, in fact, based on the principles of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. India is one of the only countries that I can think of in an era of hyper-nationalism that gives priority to global good as against focusing only on its own requirements. And we have seen this in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, when other countries were busy hoarding medicines, food and vaccines. It was India that adopted the approach of sharing and caring. We, as you all know, supplied COVID-19 vaccines and other medical equipment to a very large number of countries. More than 150 countries around the world received this kind of assistance through Vaccine Maitri and also through the COVAX program. And we have also always been in the forefront in terms of providing disaster relief and humanitarian aid to others. In fact, India has, in recent years, therefore acquired the profile and credibility of being the first provider in the region. This is acknowledged by our neighbors. It is also an integral part of the neighborhood first policy. And we saw this, for example, in the 2014 crisis in the Maldives, the drinking water shortages, when we deployed our expeditionary capabilities, aircraft, ships, to carry across large volumes of drinking water for the people of the Maldives. But one of the bigger examples on which, of course, Ambassador Ranjit Ray will share his thoughts a little later is the 2015 Nepal earthquakes, a series of earthquakes, when the National Disaster Response Force deployed several teams. We were first on the spot and we were able to deliver aid effectively in Nepal. So we have seen that India has carried out several disaster relief operations, but today the focus is shifting from disaster relief to disaster risk reduction. So I think this is where our focus should lie in these challenging times. India has shown that it is capable of rising above the sensitivities of geopolitical contestation or friction or differences of opinion to provide assistance to everyone around the world. And I think this recent example of going to Turkey is in keeping with our ethos of rising above geopolitics. Today, geopolitics trumps everything. It takes priority over economic relations. It also has the capacity to impact on state-to-state relations. But in India's case, we have shown the world how it can be done. I must briefly stop here, pause here to congratulate the NDMA, the NDRF, above all, acknowledge the great guidance and contributions provided by the Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi, and also the Principal Secretary, Dr. P.K. Mishra, to enabling us to reach where we are today. I was having a conversation yesterday or day before with someone who informed me that in Turkey, there were, of course, teams that came from Pakistan as well. And as you know, Pakistan and Turkey have very good relations. But it was the Indian team that won the hearts and minds of the local people through their professionalism, through their dedication. And I think this is enough reason for us to develop a model that we have so successfully evolved through experience in the last few years, a model that can be shared with other countries around the world, especially in the global south. We have done it in the digital space in terms of digital economy. We have done it with regard to the online platforms that we have created, the UPI, the seamless platforms for payments at virtually no cost. And therefore, at a time when India is in fact chairing the G20, when the focus is on development and SDGs, we should actually be looking at, sharing the model that we have developed with the rest of the world. India, as you know, has already taken an initiative with regard to the Coalition for, disaster resilient infrastructure. The CDRI is, as an institution, also being invited to participate in the G20 as a special invitee. And I think herein lies our strength. We must also acknowledge the fact that India has developed an all-of-government, all-of-people approach. And by that I also mean the stellar contributions of the armed forces, quite apart from the National Disaster Response Force. The armed forces of India have always supported the efforts of the NDMA. And many senior people from the armed forces also sit on the board as members and contribute their experience to the task ahead. The Indian Navy, for example, has been at the forefront of rescue, medical care and relief in places as far as Beria, Mozambique, especially post-cyclone, and long may this continue. I would also like to briefly touch upon a couple of other points. One is that, there is space in this field, disaster risk reduction, coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure, relief operations. In all this, there is space for the participation of non-governmental organizations. But in this space, we must also keep in mind that in a world that is fractured, in a world that is increasingly divided along ideological lines, sometimes along denominational lines, NGOs can play a positive as well as a negative role. And the note of caution that I want to sound is where NGOs, embed themselves in relief operations, take advantage of dire situations to promote their ideology and influence. We have seen this, including in regard to, for instance, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas on the West Bank. We have seen it with regard to organizations such as the Falah Insaniyat, a front organization and charity of the Lashkar-e-Toiba, when it comes to natural disasters in sensitive areas such as Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. So these are moments when people badly need aid and assistance, and there are therefore occasions when governments are unable to provide aid and assistance as first responders. And in this space, the NGOs can make positive contributions, but we must be mindful of the negative aspects as well. Where countries have disputed borders, where there are contested spaces, sometimes it is difficult for either side to provide aid and assistance, and this is when the local people in fact suffer the most. Sometimes one side has greater capacity, but it is the other side which has what you call control over that particular space. I think one example that I can think of is the 2015 earthquake in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, where a lot of the local people suffered a great deal. And Pakistan obviously did not have the same capacities as India has. And so these are sensitive moments when we must take a broader view of the situation. And India has always taken a broader view with regard to these things. The last point I want to mention, last 2 points, is one about cultural sensitivity in delivery of disaster relief and disaster risk reduction. When India or any other country engages the rest of the world, we have to be mindful to local cultural sensitivities, be it food habits, certain taboos, or be it clothing, which is sometimes part of relief operations. So we must keep in mind this aspect. And technological advancements today are yet another important area which can facilitate disaster risk reduction and disaster relief operations. To my mind, speech-to-speech translation technologies, for instance, are vital when it comes to responders arriving on the scene of a natural disaster and in an alien environment trying to reach out to possible survivors. or in acting in tandem with the local people. Language is often a barrier, but we must make fuller use of technology and speech-to-speech translations. And the costs of such technology or technological tools for disaster relief operations must increasingly be borne by the global community as a global good. It should not be that the developing countries do not have access to these technologies, which are also tightly held and controlled, as is the case in many other areas, by the developed countries. And I think the United Nations can also play a vital role in ensuring that such technologies are available to the global south, and that equipment based on such new technologies is manufactured in the global south on a mass scale at low production costs, so that it can be shared with the rest. And I'm sure that during India's G20 presidency, where India is committed to acting as a voice for the global south, we will have time to focus on disaster risk reduction, disaster relief, and all that the NDMA and the NDRF are trying to achieve given their mandates. In looking at regional and global cooperation, one of the finest partners for India has been and will remain Japan. Japan has vast experience with regard to natural disasters, and they are a country that have suffered a great deal, whether it is tsunamis, whether it is earthquakes, or whether it is accidents at nuclear power plants as a result of tsunamis and earthquakes, as we saw during the great Tohoku triple disaster in 2011. We therefore must work closely with Japan. We are already a signatory to the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and we have also collaborated successfully with foundations such as the Sasakawa Foundation in Japan. By the way, the Sasakawa Foundation, I can say from my experience, is in fact a first responder to natural disasters anywhere in Japan. But they have that tandem with the government. They have their eyes and ears on the ground. They have developed a community-based approach right from inception. And I must acknowledge that India has also moved towards this approach in recent years, developing a community-based approach to tackling these great challenges. So with these few words, I would like to conclude my remarks, and I am absolutely confident that we will be able to progress in this regard, and especially after hearing the views of the members of the panel. I wish you all complete success in your deliberations. Thank you very much. Should I say I thank myself for my remarks, but really we are looking forward to the other speakers now. I now invite Mr. Shombi Sharp, the UN Resident Coordinator, to kindly deliver his remarks. As you please, as you please, as you please. Follow your lead.
Namaste. मुझे विज्ञान भवन में आकर बहुत खुशी हुई. Let me thank the Honorable Chair, Sri Sujan Shinoy, for a very inspirational opening and welcoming, and express my appreciation to be joining such an esteemed panel of speakers, in particular Ambassador Ray, Mr. Proti, Sri Vatsa, also Sri Kishore, our good partners at NDMA, and just to say what an important topic this is to be discussing, and what an important place this is to be having this conversation. Colleagues, I think as has been already pointed out, we are living in a time of great commotion, chaos, where risk creation is moving faster than risk reduction. And today's challenges are interlinked, cascading, overlapping, and not respecting borders. We're still trying to emerge completely from the COVID pandemic. Then suddenly we're slammed with the effects of a terrible war, of increasing scarcity and cost of the basic necessities of life, of food and fuel, and so on. And all of this is coming against the background of the greatest existential crisis of all, that we can't for a moment lose focus on. That's the triple planetary crisis: biodiversity loss, pollution, and climate change most of all. Extreme weather events, we know cyclones and heat events and flooding and such are happening more often and with greater intensity, and we know that this is affected by human activity. Climate change has increased the number of disasters, natural disasters, by 500% in the last 50 years. If things continue on this path, we will be experiencing more than one medium to large scale disaster in the world every single day by 2030. And many of these are expected to disproportionately impact the nearly 2 billion people here in South Asia, one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change. Here in India, we've seen the impacts of natural disasters and extreme weather across the country almost every single day in just the last year alone. So, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, this February was the warmest February on record. As the Secretary General has noted, today's warmest days will, in the not too distant future, be the coolest days. Rather frightening thought. And this is why the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction is so critically important to bring countries together to support especially the most vulnerable countries and communities in disaster risk management, to support adaptation measures as well. We cannot only focus on the mitigation, we must focus on the adaptation to protect lives and livelihoods, the here and now, as well as in the future. The framework is also critical for achieving the 2030 agenda across the board, especially, again, in the most vulnerable places, particularly small island developing states, SIDS as we say, where disasters are already wiping out years and decades of development within minutes. So together, giving communities the tools to adapt, to build resilience against multiple overlapping risks and climate impacts, this is a priority for the United Nations, for the member states of the United Nations, at country level and at the international level. And therefore, I'm so pleased to see, we are so pleased to see India's very strong and vibrant leadership in this space, and the discussions of this third national platform on disaster risk reduction are precisely moving this conversation forward. We see the examples of India's leadership in so many different areas. One most foremost, let's say, in the thinking at this very moment is the fact that with India's G20 presidency, for the very first time, the G20 now has a working group on disaster risk reduction, and initiatives that India is promoting across the board. The entire spectrum of mitigation to adaptation are critically important, from International Solar Alliance to the Coalition for Disaster Risk Resilience Infrastructure as well. The priorities of the G20 Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group are perfectly aligned with the priorities of the Sustainable Development Goals and reflect, for example, the importance of having multi-hazard early warning systems, global disaster response systems, disaster resilient infrastructure, ecosystem-based solutions, and stronger financial frameworks providing financial resources, especially to developing countries and communities. So as a country on the front line of climate change, India's upcoming midterm review of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction implementation will both, of course, inform progress in planning and implementation here in India, but it will also go far in informing the DRR priorities and good practices at the global level and build momentum for the global Sendai Framework high-level midterm review at the General Assembly this coming May. So the need of the hour, dear colleagues, now is enhanced international cooperation in disaster risk prevention, response, and recovery, again, especially for the least developed countries, especially for those small island developing states that are suffering so much more, have the least resources to cope, and have contributed the least amount to the problems that we are facing. So as I mentioned, one of the most cost-effective ways to reduce risk, to save lives, is the early warning systems for all. The UN Secretary General has spearheaded a global initiative on early warning systems for all, and is very much grateful for the leadership of India, both in terms of introducing effective early warning systems here within India, across the coast, for the people of India, with essentially 100% coverage, as well as supporting the Secretary General's global initiative and working with other countries to help improve their capacities. As we know, just a 24-hour warning of a coming storm, for example, can help reduce the damage by fully 1/3. Yet, over a third of the world's populations, again, mostly in least developed countries and small island states, do not have access to such systems. So the role of India, both in protecting the Indian population, as well as supporting other countries, cannot be overestimated, the importance of that role. And in supporting, for example, the United Nations initiative recently launched on Complex Risk Analytics Fund, which is a multilateral effort to help support global data ecosystems on DRR. Because again, it's about data and capabilities and leveraging the power of innovation and technology, of which India is, again, such a leader. As the Secretary General has pointed out, it is the poorer countries and the poorer communities which are often doubly victimized by climate change and not supported by today's deeply unjust global financial system, which is why the Secretary General's recently launched SDG stimulus plan calls for debt relief, for disaster clauses, for concessional funding needed to invest in resilience against natural disasters for those in greatest need. There is simply no better time, again, as I started with saying, to be having this conversation. It's the need of the hour. And to be having this conversation here in Vigyan Bhawan in India, given India's leadership and growing leadership in so many of the issues that impact the overall narrative that we're talking about. We look at the Honorable Prime Minister's commitments, Panchamrit commitments at the COP26, which established a new level of narrative in terms of investments in many areas, especially renewable energy. We look at the role that India has played in terms of promoting climate justice, a just green transition, which is understanding that the green transition, unfortunately, cannot only be green. It cannot just be green. It must be just, meaning fair and green. The important milestone agreement of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27, which still needs to be financed, but this very much fits with India's leadership and voice of the Global South in terms of that right to development that every person has. India's leadership in the G20 on pushing for reform of the global financial architecture, reform of the multilateral development banks to ensure that financing is made available to developing countries now and in the way that they need it. India's leadership on women-led development, the digital transformation, as was mentioned, digital public goods, technology seen as something that is a public good, not just for large corporates or wealthy. And finally, just to mention that the timing, again, it's as if the stars are aligning, because India's G20 presidency will conclude and will literally handshake directly to the global SDG summit in New York a matter of days afterwards. So, for example, India is working now on the G20 SDG Acceleration Action Plan, which will essentially bring a sort of prepared meal to the table of the global SDG summit, where the world comes together to take stock of where we are on track, where we are off track, and how to get back on track. And this is where India's voice is incredibly important, and the conversation we're having today is incredibly important. So let me just conclude in saying, Aaj ki charcha achi rahe. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's a great honor. Bahut dhanyavad.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sharp, for your remarks. I now invite Ambassador Ranjit Rai to share his thoughts with us. We have 3 speakers, and since we started rather late, I'm told that we have only the next 20 minutes or so, but I would like to request them to make use of those 20 minutes, as in the 3 of them.
Thank you, distinguished co-chairs, panelists, distinguished participants, Mr. Kamal Kishore. It's a pleasure to be here at this conference, though I'm not an expert either on HADR or disaster risk reduction. But what I would like to share with you is a lived experience of what happened in Nepal in 2015, when there was an earthquake of 7.8 on the Richter scale, followed by several hundred aftershocks, and then another very, very severe earthquake of more than 7 on the Richter scale. And unfortunately, we're not able to show you the film, but I'm sure most of you know about the terrain of Nepal. It's a very mountainous region, far-flung area, it's very difficult to access. The weather conditions are not necessarily appropriate for a massive relief operation. So it's a very difficult terrain. And some 9,000 people perished in this earthquake. More than twice that number were injured. 500,000 houses destroyed. So it was really a very, very massive calamity, very massive tragedy. And it was very evident, Nepal being a least developed country, it was very evident that they do not have the capacity and the resources to undertake the kind of relief operation that was necessary. And I think this is where the government of India stepped in. And to this day, I think that was probably the largest ever humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operation that India had launched. And since then, I think we all know about the operation in Turkey, where the NDRF and other organizations played a very important role. I would like to really start with one anecdote to tell you of how this response of India, which was the first and primary responder, it was the sort of swiftest response of any country. And within 6 hours, our people were on the ground in Kathmandu. So how did this happen? And the anecdote that I've narrated, I've written a book also called Kathmandu Dilemma, where I have a chapter on this earthquake. But the anecdote was as follows. It appears that on that Saturday, our Prime Minister was traveling in his motorcade somewhere in Delhi when he felt this earthquake. On inquiring, he was told that it was in Nepal, some 70 kilometers northwest of Kathmandu. And I think he realized immediately that this was a very massive calamity. An emergency cabinet meeting was convened, and within 6 hours, our aircraft with NDRF teams, military teams, medical teams, and immediate relief material that was required had landed in Kathmandu. So this was really a whole of government response. And those of us who worked in the government of India know how difficult it is to coordinate the different agencies and organizations. So this was really a very, very dramatic response. And I think it happened because of the experience of the Prime Minister and, of course, Dr. P.K. Mishra, who was then the additional Principal Secretary, their experiences of what had happened in Bhuj, in Gujarat, many years ago. So this whole of government response was primarily due to a political commitment at the highest level. And just to give you some idea of what was involved, we had our Indian Air Force transport planes. They made 31 sorties, carrying 16 NDRF teams, 3 teams of Army engineers, 2 Army hospitals, many medical teams, 570 tons of relief material, medical supplies, oxygen concentrators, tents, tarpaulins. So it was really a huge effort. We had 13 Indian Air Force helicopters that were stationed in Nepal, basically ferrying teams places that were affected, including international teams, rescuing people who were affected, not just Nepalese and Indians, but many, many foreigners who were stuck in far-flung areas. And we sent a huge amount of support also by road. In addition, we had many delegations. We had, within 6 days, a high-level delegation of our National Security Advisor, the Additional Principal Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, to express solidarity with Nepal and full commitment of the government of India. And people had asked what was the magnitude of support. So the magnitude of support in the initial phase, which was relief and rescue, was about $65 million. And then in the reconstruction and rehabilitation phase, it was $1 billion. So I don't think we've made this kind of commitment anywhere, and it was good that we made it in our neighborhood. So the purpose of narrating all this is to see what lessons we can derive from this episode. And the first one, I think, is we have to make a distinction between the support we extend in our immediate neighborhood and the support that we extend in other places. For instance, the kind of effort we made in Nepal is obviously different from the kind of support and assistance that we render in Turkey. And this naturally requires different templates. So in our neighborhood, our HADR is really a very important pillar of the neighborhood first policy of the government. And clearly, the manner in which this assistance is rendered, is extended, is going to be different. At an international level, we have the United Nations, and especially OCHA, that is responsible for coordinating international support for disaster relief. But I think in our neighborhood, where India is present, we have huge equities, huge leverage, huge connections and connectivity with the authorities and governments of our neighborhood. So I think a different template perhaps here would be more effective and more useful. And just a few key issues that I wanted to talk about. This whole issue of coordination is so critical, and it's not just coordination within the government, within the sending government and the receiving government, but also between the two governments. And in this particular case, in India, we also had excellent civil-military coordination. So it wasn't just the NDRF that was involved, the Indian Army and the Indian Air Force were involved in a huge way in this whole effort that we made. So we had the Integrated Defense Staff, we had the Crisis Management Committee headed by our Cabinet Secretary, we had the Indian Embassy based in Kathmandu, we had the host government, the Nepalese government, and technically this was, disaster relief was a matter under the Ministry of Home Affairs. We had the Nepalese army, which was really the main responder in Nepal because of the resources that they commanded. And then, of course, there was the United Nations that was coordinating assistance from many, many countries. I think one of the most important things that happened when this earthquake struck, I think on the very first flight that came to Kathmandu, we had two senior officers from our armed forces. We had a major general from the army and we had a senior Air Force officer who were on the ground to help the embassy assist this magnitude of response. While we had, of course, prepared our contingency plans and so on in the event of calamity, the embassy is not necessarily equipped to handle a crisis of this magnitude, and especially when it comes to coordination between these different institutions and organizations. So I think, this major, the army coordination that we had was extremely important, and why it was successful is because of the relationship that you have between the Indian and the Nepalese armies. So the point I want to make here is that military to military diplomacy is really critical when it comes to HADR responses of India, especially in our neighborhood. And this is something that we really need to strengthen. We're already doing a lot, but extremely important. On the civil side, we had a daily coordination with the Crisis Management Committee headed by the Cabinet Secretary, and we had the Secretary of the NDMA, we had Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, we had the Chief Secretaries of the state governments bordering Nepal as and when required. And this system worked extremely well because you had the military coordination on one side, you had the general in Kathmandu who was the link between the Nepalese army, the Indian army, and between the Nepalese army and the embassy. And the embassy was the link with the crisis management committee. So we were all working on, on the same page, and it was really seamless coordination. And obviously, given the fact that the Prime Minister's office was taking critical interest in this operation, I think Operation Maitri was extremely successful. Apart from military diplomacy, the other aspect I also want to mention is this issue of visibility and media management. I think Ambassador Chinoy referred to the need to take into account the cultural sensitivities in the countries where we are undertaking these operations. And for instance, in our neighborhood, we also need to take in the political context of the nature of the relationship between, say, Nepal and India, and how we really need to be sensitive. So what happened after the earthquake is a whole series of Indian television channels, reporters descended on Kathmandu, and these channels are also watched very keenly in Nepal. And so the channels started projecting news basically by saying that it is the government of India that is doing everything in Nepal. Rather than saying that, the Indian assistance is supporting what the Nepalese authorities are doing, the impression that was created was as if India is doing everything in Nepal. And this naturally led to a huge backlash in the media, in the Nepalese media. And so there were all kinds of rumors about, the Indian army has come into Nepal, it won't go back. The Indian helicopters are deployed only to rescue Indians. Indian food relief, etc., is substandard, not fit for human consumption. So we had a lot of this kind of very negative commentary in the Nepalese media. Of course, when I was the ambassador then, we had to really, upfront rebut all these misinformation and stuff that was happening through a series of interviews, etc. And really, so basically, I think it's very important that our media, apart from the people who are involved in this relief effort, the media also needs to be very carefully briefed about, the sensitivities that may be involved. And the second thing is the visibility. I think this was our first time when such a huge operation was launched. And so, we had our NDRF teams in Kathmandu and other places, and they did a phenomenal job, extremely good job, and it was all covered in international newspapers, Herald Tribune and so on, or the International New York Times, etc. They had pictures of our teams, but the jackets that the NDRF teams had only said NDRF. So they were not identified as being Indian responders to what was happening in Nepal. And this is the recommendation I made. I'm very happy to see in the case of Turkey, for instance, you have now on the jackets and the logos NDRF India, so that people know that it's India. And the same thing, I think, in terms of the relief, the tents, tarps, whatever we send must have branding that it is from India. And other countries may perhaps send very little, but they extract by this kind of branding, etc. I think they sometimes have a greater impact. So I think visibility, and this is one aspect that also needs to be considered by us. Of course, the best visibility for us was, we sent some 2,000 trucks full of relief material going to the 14 most affected districts in Nepal, and so the people knew. But the trucks also should have some Indian branding. Of course, they have Indian number plates, but it's important that they have some branding and people know that all this has come from India. The next aspect, of course, is that we were not involved only in the research and rescue, in the relief, the search and rescue, but very deeply involved in the rehabilitation and the reconstruction phase. We had a team of 4 senior people, led by Mr. V. Tirupugas from the NDMA, or then I think this was a team from Gujarat. We had Anshu Sharma, Nisar Dave, and Mr. Panda, and these 4 people came to Nepal, worked with the National Planning Commission for several weeks, and prepared an outstanding PDNA document, post-disaster needs assessment, which was pegged at $7 billion US. And it's on this basis that this pledging conference was organized for Nepal, where our then External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj made a pledge of $1 billion for reconstruction, of which $250 million was a grant and $750 million was a concessional line of credit. And I'm very happy to say that a lot of this reconstruction effort has already taken place in terms of houses. This whole build back better and owner-driven approach was very successful in Sri Lanka. It's been applied in Nepal as well, and has worked very well. Another point that our chair, Ambassador Chinoy, mentioned was the role of NGOs. And I think this is a very important point. So apart from the central government and the state governments that sent a lot of relief material and teams, we had a lot of NGOs. We had langars that were established by Sikh organizations. We had groups such as Dera Sacha Sauda, Patanjali, TISS, Akshay Patra, Oxfam India, Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, Seva Bharati. They all came to Nepal and helped a lot at the grassroots level. Where the government agencies cannot reach, the NGOs reach. But our NGOs face a huge problem because under our FEMA rules and regulations, Indian NGOs cannot transfer money abroad for their relief activities. And so we had to really fight with the finance ministry to get exceptions to this rule. And we did get one-time exceptions for some of the organizations. But I think we need to look at this more carefully. In sensitive areas, I mean, I don't want to go into details, but in certain, and especially the mountainous regions of Nepal, for instance, the government of Nepal may not be very comfortable with the government of India organization extending relief assistance and support. Whereas if there were NGOs, then perhaps those sensitivities would not be so salient. So I think this is one aspect that we really need to look at. The NGOs supplement the work that the government and the central agencies are trying to do, and instead of making things difficult for them, we have to try and make it easier for them. So I think these financial rules, these very tight financial rules that we have for Indian NGOs who raise money in India and then try to do work abroad needs to be reviewed. The last point I wanted to make, see, you have global disasters everywhere. God forbid you could also have disasters in India. Now, I don't know whether we have a consistent policy in terms of what happens if, say, a huge disaster, God forbid, were to affect India. Would we be willing to accept international support and assistance? We may not. But if we are willing to accept this assistance in a spirit of international solidarity, which is the spirit in which we extend assistance to other countries, then we need to develop very clear templates within our own country also. Because I know from the Nepalese experience, when a whole lot of foreign agencies, organizations, NGOs descend on a small country in Kathmandu, it's not easy. Unless you have very clear-cut templates and standards of procedures, it's not very easy for the government to handle it. So I think I'll conclude there. I think Sujan is getting a little nervous, but that's where I come.
Thank you very much, Ranjit, for your remarks. I'll come straight to the next speaker, Shri Amit Prothi. Please make judicious use of the remaining time.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chairs, fellow panelists, audience, eminent individuals in the audience. I think CDRI's name has come up several times. I'm very honored actually to be here representing the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. It's a really, really ambitious agenda that the Prime Minister has set up. How do we show global leadership on disaster resilient infrastructure? And I just want to take a moment to reflect on an anecdote, because I actually happened to be in Kathmandu when the earthquake hit. Because I was working for the ADB doing some consulting work on planning for disasters, and I happened to be, it was a day off, I was in Saturday, I was walking in the hills, literally standing. I have images of taking photographs of Kathmandu Valley. When you go in walking in the hills, you look down and take photographs. I'm taking photographs, I step away and the earthquake hits. Of course, we are all shaken up. I come back and I take photographs as the earthquake is ongoing, and you see these amazing amount of dust clouds rising in the valley. Now, I'm about an hour away, so if you know the hills of Kathmandu, I'm about an hour away from the city, and I'm with an Australian colleague, and I'm with a guide and all those things. And we're seeing this devastation from where our vantage point. We can't see anything. I mean, this is too far away to actually see, but you see dust clouds. So of course we're all shaken up. We find our way somehow back into the edges of the city. We come into the city. Now this has always remained with me. I expected every building to have collapsed because the shaking was, it went on for about a minute. It was really scary. I imagined that the buildings would all be gone. And yet I walk in and I see, you know what? 1 out of every 6 or 7 buildings has fallen. And 5 buildings or 6 buildings are actually okay. Now why am I explaining that example? Because we are talking about DRR. And you realize that the Japanese, and this is about collaboration, the Japanese government had spent a fair amount of time with the Nepalese government to put in place some really good building codes. And the devastation that could have actually been way worse wasn't way worse because the building codes have actually worked. And that memory for me has always remained because it reminds you that we can actually do something ahead of time to prevent these events. These events will happen, earthquakes, cyclones, these will happen and get worse. But the impact of those events don't have to be as bad as they can be if you don't prepare for it. So the whole argument for DRR for me is very real. So, as a coalition, what are we trying to do? Why has the government set up the coalition? Why are we thinking about a global coalition? We've got about 31 countries and 8 organizations that are part of this coalition. It is definitely India-led, but it also includes very senior representation from a lot of other governments. And really the opportunity is how do we build an organization that represents the voice of the global south? And that is important. When you think about what the Prime Minister and the whole G20 agenda about one Earth, one family, one future, the Ambassador in his comments highlighted that our approach to global problems is quite magnanimous at one level. And the idea of the coalition is also about how do we actually build an organization that brings together practices to the global front so that we're actually contributing to a global good. So in that context, CDRI started to look at the small island development states. When you look around the world, you start to realize that there are some countries, particularly in the small island development states, that are incredibly vulnerable. Now, even this month, if you were reading the news, the island of Vanuatu in the Pacific, within a span of 48 hours, was hit by a 6.4 magnitude earthquake and 2 Category 4 cyclones within 48 hours, affecting 80% of the population. When you look at climate change, you start to recognize that the worst impacted will be these islands. And we don't need to look far away in the Pacific, we don't need to look far away in the Caribbean. We've experienced in 2004 what happened in Andaman Nicobar Islands, right? We saw a tsunami with waves up to 15 meters in height. And we realized that a lot of these islands are not even 3, 4, 5, 6 meters above sea level. So when you start thinking about the impacts of climate change, it's not just about sea level rise. Then sea level rise is a little bit long-term. But you have cyclones, you have storm surges, you have tsunamis. So the risks in these islands is really getting more and more exacerbated. And these islands are very isolated. A lot of their economies, and I think all of us, or most of us, would love to get on a plane and go to an island to have a nice vacation. That's wonderful, but also means that most of these islands are very driven by one kind of an economy. Tourism may be the only sector in some places, other places there is similar isolated economic drivers. And because of their uniqueness of their economic structures, they're again vulnerable because of that primary driver shuts down. As tourism shut down during COVID, if you look at the data, you realize that islands suffered about 9% of their GDP was lost, whereas across the world about 3.1% of the GDP was lost because of a disaster. So islands themselves are incredibly vulnerable, and for CDRI, for this ambition of bringing global collaboration to do something in a vulnerable region of the world, we basically said, let's look at what can we do to support. So we have, and again, this ethos of collaboration. So, CDRI has set up a trust fund collaboratively with multiple governments. UK has contributed. Of course, Indian government is the major contributor. EU has contributed. Australia has contributed. The idea is that we start to bring technical assistance, capacity building support to SIDS. And SIDS across the world. And that's important. Because SIDS, when you start looking at who are the different, UN is involved in SIDS, World Bank is involved in SIDS, ADB is involved in SIDS, IDB is involved in SIDS. So why should CDRI, what is our role? You realize a lot of these organizations, their mandates don't allow them to work across SIDS. ADB will work only in the Pacific. IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, will work only in the Caribbean. Other organizations may work only in the LDCs. In a way, the coalition structure allows us to work across all SIDS. And why is that important? It's important because lessons actually relate to the context. So there are some SIDS that are really low income. There are some SIDS that are okay, they're not low income, they're actually quite affluent. So the lessons from affluent SIDS to affluent SIDS, the lessons from low income development SIDS to low income development SIDS, that context becomes incredibly important. And again, for CDRI, because our mandate is more open, it is not limited to just one kind of SID. It allows us to work across different SIDs. So we've operationalized this program through launching the call for proposals. So the Honorable Prime Minister, along with 5 other Prime Ministers at COP26, announced that we will do something in small island development states. We launched an Infrastructure for Resident Island States program. COP27 last year, we launched a call for proposals. We had, we spent time in different regions, partnering with different organizations, IORA in the Indian Ocean, PIFs in the Pacific Ocean, trying to understand what is the opportunity, where can we compete. And we realized that the technical assistance was the need of the hour. And we essentially launched a call for proposals at COP27. And last month, we closed the call. And what was amazing is out of 50 SIDS, 29 responded to put in proposals. And these are for early warning systems. These are for coastal infrastructure resilience. These are for social infrastructure resilience. So just the sheer numbers, and CDRI is brand new. If you think about CDRI, we are actually very, very new. Who knows us in the global system? And yet, 50 out of 50, 29 SIDS responded and asking for technical assistance. So it kind of shows you there's a huge need for this kind of a support. So we are in the process of now looking at what we support. We will not obviously be able to support 50. We're looking to support about 12 to 15. And the idea is that this is a collaboration respectfully from the global south, working with SIDS around the world, trying to learn. I mean, India has a lot to learn, but also share what we've been doing. With that, over to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Mr. Proti. You shared your hands-on experience with us. I now turn to Sri Krishna Vatsa, the member of the Indian. He too is going to speak from personal experience.
Thank you. Can the President? Yes, thank you. I'm very conscious of the fact that I have to chair the next session. So, I will be very brief and to the point and, in fact, rushed. What I'm going to present is how India's disaster assistance strategy should evolve from its bilateral setting to the multilateral setting. Ambassador Ranjit Ray referred to India's bilateral approach to disaster assistance when he spoke about Nepal. But it's time also to evolve. So I will touch upon those things. It's about, in parlance of global diplomacy, India is called an emerging donor. But India doesn't like to be called a donor. So we always use the term development partner. And traditionally, we have been providing assistance 3 ways: bilateral aid, ITC training program, and ICCR cultural exchange. In addition, through the Exim Bank, we have been providing a line of soft credit to the developing countries. This is broadly the contour of our international assistance. And this size and scale of assistance would be delivered bilaterally. It was not large enough to engage the multilateral system. However, the situation has changed in the recent years. One, India has expanded the scale of assistance. We are extending around 6,000 crores of rupees 6,000 crore of assistance annually. It's on a grants basis. It's a sizable assistance. It merits actually an independent aid organization. And when you reinforce it with the soft loans and other forms of support, India is now a significant provider of international assistance. India also has taken some concrete steps towards joining the multilateral framework. We have set up CDRI, we have set up International Solar Alliance, and at the UN level, we have also set up India-UN Development Partnership Fund. It's a very, very important development, $100 million. So it's a big change in the situation. Externally too, we are living in a different world. One is the rise of Global South, which you referred. India is in the vanguard of that. And also there is a huge need for global climate action, and India also must lead that process. Along with that, the Western humanitarian aid has been questioned, its motivation, its efficacy, its impact. And the governments also in developing world, they do not always welcome humanitarian assistance. They prefer assistance which are aimed at medium and long-term needs. So the character of the assistance actually that the governments expect has also changed. Now, we have been providing disaster assistance for a long time. It reflects our foundational value, which Mr. Chinoy actually referred to. We have provided considerable assistance to neighboring countries, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Afghanistan. But we have also provided assistance to developed countries. After Hurricane Katrina, we provided plane loads of assistance to US, and after Fukushima, we also sent assistance to Japan. We have supported countries in the Caribbean and South Pacific. So, we have now an extensive international footprint of assistance. But it's also time to think of a long-term disaster assistance strategy, where we provide support to countries at a critical time, earn goodwill and gratitude. That's very, very important. Definitely our strategic interests are also important. We need to go beyond our immediate and humanitarian needs and provide medium-term support, because that is what the countries are valuing more. And as it was referred, technical assistance is equally important along with the financial support. What are also very, very important is this speed and timeliness, that we deliver it fast. The assistance is delivered on the ground. And I would say that in Nepal, the actual program was implemented in a longer time frame than that was desired. And also that we should maintain the standards of accountability. It is Indian taxpayers' money, and we must get the results for the investment that we make. Now, there are 3 broad strands of policy that we need to follow. Bilateral assistance to certain countries, particularly in neighborhood. Ambassador Ranjit Ray mentioned about this, that for the bilateral countries, we should have a different template. For the neighborhood countries, we should have a different template. Then there is a huge amount of support that we need to extend to our regional groupings. And in all the regional groupings, disaster management is an important subject. SARC, BIMSTEC, SCO, IORA, and there is a lot of demand, and we need to meet those demands. And then multilateral assistance to countries, organizations working on disasters, which expand India's outreach. So these are the three broad strands of policy that we need to observe. Now there are three global models which I have brought here for your attention. US, they provide immediate disaster assistance to countries through OFDA. OFDA is part of US State Department. It provides immediate assistance. So it's very, very important. Japan provides a whole lot of support through JICA. It's soft loans generally, and considerable assistance to international organizations on disaster management. That's Japan's model. And European Union, that provides humanitarian support through ECHO, a small amount of support, but it provides a huge amount of medium-term assistance to EU countries. So these are three important models of providing disaster assistance across the countries. Based on this, these are the recommendations. Open a new window for disaster assistance in UN-India Development Partnership Fund. It can easily be set up. Leverage CDRI for reaching out to countries. Extremely important. You have been doing this, and a lot depends upon CDRI's performance. We have a lot of expectations of you. I must underscore that. Then we also need to acknowledge the importance of regional organizations. Some countries, regional organizations, particularly in Africa, African Union, East African Community, all these are very, very important. And in some of these countries, we may support the regional organizations. And then active participation in aid consortiums, technical partnership, assistance and partnership with UN and development banks. So these are extremely important multilateral mechanisms that we must support. India is in a position to do that. So what are the salient features? One, of course, is the quantum of assistance. How much money to be provided? Of course, it will depend upon the strategic importance of countries. Annually, how many countries we may need to provide support. What is also very important is that we need to have a stronger collaboration between NDMA and MEA based on SOPs, training programs. We should draw upon India's professional and technical agencies, including our private sector, NGOs, and we should also channel India's resources through diaspora. Very, very important. And finally, we should develop a confident multilateral mindset. Extremely important that we participate actively in multilateral discussions. This is where I find that we have been falling very short. We are more comfortable engaging bilaterally, and we always fight shy of engaging in multilateral negotiations. We should have consistent long-term engagement. We should be able to use our influence to influence the direction of outcomes the way Western countries do that. Very, very important. We should understand the risks of assistance and learn to spread them across the agencies. And finally, we should come across as a dependable partner with an equitable treatment to recipient countries. We should have a different way of looking at the recipient countries compared to the Western countries. So these are some of the important strands of our new disaster management strategy that we would recommend. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are completely out of time. I've been reminded at least 3 times that we should bring these proceedings to a close. But I'll be remiss in my duty if I did not pick on briefly a point from each of the 3 speakers who followed the chair and the co-chair. From Ambassador Ranjit Rai's presentation, the one point that stands out for me is the need to manage the social media space also, and also to manage the narrative on the ground. So this requires considerable deliberation and coordination between the agencies, and invariably it should be done at a single point. There should not be a multiplicity or redundancy in terms of the number of people who are actually talking to, say, the media or giving out various narratives. So controlling the narrative is extremely important, and for this I think wherever our teams go, they must establish very quick and real-time contact with community leaders. For we have to also account for potential disinformation or misinformation in a world which is fragmented, a world in which there is growing geopolitical contestation. There is a contestation for winning the hearts and minds of public opinion in various countries. It's very important that our teams actually negate that by establishing timely contact with community leaders. I was also wondering if, as far as NGOs are concerned, is it possible to develop some kind of a blue ribbon panel, kind of recognition to NGOs, provided they meet certain standards established by the authorities, and that these can be put up on website, they can be shared with countries in the global south, those that are most prone to natural disasters, and from time to time the authorities in India should organize briefings for them so that they are up to speed with what is happening in technology, in SOPs, etc. And I would imagine that such a scheme could also be run for young reporters from across India. Every now and then a small module should be conducted for young reporters, for these are the ones who will ultimately go on the ground in other countries and report on your work being done there. So that's one point. The second is that there is a plethora of codes, rules and regulation. In our country too, we do not lack rules and regulations, but it is in the implementation that there is lacuna. So how is it that what is it that we can do more to overcome the non-implementation of codes, building codes, for instance, infrastructure codes, because we were told that following infrastructure codes, even in Kathmandu, in collaboration with, say, Japan, saved the day for many and perhaps resulted in mitigating the absolute numbers in terms of loss of life. So I think we need to emphasize adherence to codes, and for that there must be some punitive action also. It cannot be left to the public at large to decide whether they wish to follow codes once codes have been put in place. Prime Minister, I know, has emphasized quite recently use of our indigenous knowledge and technologies also. I think he made a reference to the bungas of Kutch, if I'm not mistaken, which are kind of disaster resilient infrastructure of our own. The last point I want to make is this, extraordinary importance of not only doing things bilaterally, but also doing it trilaterally and multilaterally. And today, our expeditionary capabilities allow us to, as was pointed out, reach out to the furthest corners of the world. We are able to deliver aid and assistance in the furthest corners of the vast oceanic spaces with the help of our Indian Air Force and the Indian Navy. Our Indian Navy ships always carry pre-prepared pallets and bricks whenever they sail out, even in peacetime, which is why we are able to immediately direct them, even on the high seas, to go and deliver aid and assistance. These SOPs that we have, we must work in tandem with like-minded partners. The quadrilateral security dialogue, for instance, allows us to discuss HADR, and we must be ready to respond in tandem with a partner appropriately, for instance, in the space beyond our own waters, in Micronesia, in Melanesia, in Polynesia. Likewise, we must be open to the idea of one or more of those partners working in tandem with us, and there we can actually share our best practices. So with these few words, I would like to bring this very important thematic session to a close, and I want to thank my co-chair and all the eminent speakers who shared their views with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our distinguished chair, our co-chair and all the eminent panelists, as I request our session chair, Shri Sujan R. Chinoy ji, to kindly do the honors of presenting a green certificate as a token of gratitude to all our eminent panelists. We begin by presenting to our co-chair, Shri Shombi Shah. So ladies and gentlemen, this green certificate is a certificate where in name of the receiver, a thicket of 50 mangrove trees will be planted on the coast of Mumbai. So you're also contributing by participating in this conference. You're contributing towards the nature. Thank you very much indeed, sir. We present to our eminent panelist, Shri Ranjit Ray. Thank you, sir, for your deliberations, your wonderful insights. We present to Shri Amit Prothi ji. Thank you, sir, for your insightful address. And to Dr. Krishna S. Vatsa, member NDMA. Thank you, sir, for that informative presentation we had. And I would request our session coordinator, Shri Naval Prakash ji, to present a green certificate to our session chair, Shri Chinoy. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together once again for our session chair for wonderfully chairing this session. We're extremely sorry, sir really wanted to have question and answers and interaction with the audience, but we are really running late on schedule. Can we have a group photograph, sir? Thank you. But all our eminent speakers will be here with us during the day. You can catch hold of them and get your queries solved on one-to-one basis if you have any. Thank you once again, sir, for that wonderful session. I would request everyone to kindly remain seated as we straight away move to our next session, with this thematic session 8 on capacity building in disaster risk reduction. We would request just few minutes. We need to change the top table for the next session. Thank you. उपस्थित सभी माननीय अतिथिगण से निवेदन है, कृपया अपने स्थान पर बैठे रहें। कुछ ही समय में हम शुरुआत करेंगे अगले